I never thought I'd see the day when I'd become the target of my own father's greed, but that's exactly what happened. I grew up believing he'd always have my back, no matter what. My mother passed away when I was 15, and it was just the two of us for a long time. He did his best, and I tried to support him in every way. I was the one who saved up for college scholarships and took on part-time jobs to ease our financial burdens. He always told me he was proud of me. When I finished school, I found a decent job in marketing, saved diligently for years, and eventually bought my own house. It wasn't anything lavish, just a modest 3-bedroom in a nice neighborhood, but it was something I worked hard for and was proud of. Dad eventually remarried. I have no problem with the concept of remarriage, but something about his new wife, whom I'll call Teresa, never sat right with me. She was about 10 years younger than Dad, and she had this practiced sweetness about her that reminded me of artificial sweetener. In other words, she seemed nice at first glance, but left a weird aftertaste. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, though. Dad was smitten, and I wanted him to be happy. They had their own place for a while, but Dad called me one afternoon sounding embarrassed. He told me he'd been laid off from his job in construction and had trouble finding something else. Teresa wasn't working at the time, so their household income was basically non-existent. Bills were stacking up, and they were on the brink of losing their apartment. I didn't even think twice before offering them space in my home. Family is family, right? I thought I'd be a good son. I was so wrong. They arrived a week later with a few suitcases and boxes of kitchen items. I'd cleared out the guest bedroom for them, along with the smaller 3rd bedroom that I used as an office. I figured Teresa might appreciate some personal space. In the beginning, things were cordial. Teresa thanked me politely for letting them stay, and Dad repeatedly said how grateful he was. I showed them around the house, handed them an extra set of keys, and explained how I was willing to cover utilities for a while. I didn't mind. I was used to paying the bills on my own anyway, and I had some savings to cushion any unexpected increase in expenses. During that first week, Teresa was surprisingly helpful. She reorganized my messy pantry, folded my laundry, and even cooked dinner a couple of times. Dad chipped in by mowing the lawn and fixing a leaky faucet I'd been ignoring for months. I let myself relax, thinking we'd get along just fine. Even so, I couldn't shake that odd feeling that Teresa's behavior was more about establishing control. She'd rearrange the living room furniture without asking or throw away items she considered useless. Dad would shrug, saying she was trying to be productive, but I started feeling like a guest in my own house. Still, I reminded myself that they were under a lot of stress. Dad was applying for jobs, though he complained about the lack of opportunities. Teresa talked about wanting to start a small online business, but she never elaborated beyond that. I tried to be supportive. I told them to take their time, to get back on their feet without worrying about deadlines. I believed they'd appreciate that freedom and not overstep. I had no idea how quickly I'd regret my generosity. I noticed small changes right away. Teresa replaced my favorite coffee brand with some cheap, bitter blend because she claimed it was more economical. She also went through my closet, pulling out clothes she deemed too worn out, and tossed them without asking. I confronted Dad about it, and he insisted Teresa meant well. He told me to be patient, that she had a knack for running a household, and maybe I could learn a thing or two from her. That stung. I'd been managing my own life just fine. I didn't need a lecture from someone who treated my personal belongings like garbage, but still, I tried not to make a big deal out of it. I figured they were both anxious about their uncertain future. Maybe Teresa was trying to prove she was useful. A few days later, she sat me down in the living room, asking if I could help her fund her online business idea. She wanted me to invest a significant sum into her project without offering any concrete plan. I told her politely that I wasn't comfortable handing over money without details. Her face hardened, and she abruptly ended the discussion. Dad seemed oblivious, or maybe he was just pretending not to notice the tension. Things escalated when I discovered Teresa had moved into the master bedroom. She claimed she and Dad needed more space. I found my belongings crammed into boxes in what used to be my own room, replaced by their suitcases and clothes. I was furious. I confronted Dad, but he muttered something about how he was too old to sleep in a cramped guest room. Teresa glared at me, daring me to argue. I felt powerless in my own house. Every attempt to enforce boundaries turned into a guilt trip about how they were struggling, and I needed to be more understanding. About a month after they moved in, Teresa decided to call me into the kitchen for a serious talk. Dad was there, arms folded, staring at the floor. She cut straight to the point. She believed I should start paying them rent for the master bedroom, since, in her mind, I was occupying space in their household. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. This was my house, purchased with my own money, yet here she was treating me like a freeloader. I glanced at Dad, expecting him to defend me, but he just avoided my eyes. He mumbled something about how Teresa was handling the finances now, so maybe it was fair to share costs. I was livid. I reminded them that I was already covering the mortgage, the utilities, and the groceries. Teresa blinked, saying she and Dad were providing me with a stable environment, so it only made sense that I contribute. I pointed out that I literally owned the house, but she shrugged off my words like I was being ridiculous. Dad spoke up, telling me not to make a scene, that we could come to an arrangement. He said that maybe paying a small rent would bring harmony and show I was committed to our family's well-being. I felt something snap. The betrayal was too obvious to ignore. Dad, my own father, was siding with this woman who was basically trying to extort me in my own home. I refused outright, telling them there was no way I'd pay a dime. Teresa's eyes flashed with anger. She threatened to stop cooking and cleaning if I didn't comply. She said if I was going to act like a child, I'd be treated like one. There was no mention of gratitude for the free living arrangement I'd already been providing. Instead of backing down, I started planning my next move. I knew that legally, the house was in my name. They had no lease, no ownership claim. They were essentially guests and overstaying their welcome. I decided to consult an attorney friend of mine. I didn't want an ugly confrontation, but I also refused to be bullied in my own home. My friend confirmed that I had every right to evict them if they wouldn't respect my terms. The thought of doing that to my own father weighed heavily on me, but Teresa was leaving me no choice. I also began documenting everything. I kept a record of the bills I was paying, the groceries I was buying, and the times Teresa made outrageous demands. I wrote down dates and even snapped photos of my possessions they'd tossed or stored away without permission. I wanted to build a solid case, just in case things escalated. Meanwhile, Dad grew more distant. Sometimes I'd see him in the living room, his head bowed, as Teresa barked orders about what needed to be cleaned or rearranged. He didn't seem happy, but he never contradicted her. It felt like he was letting her run the show, even when it hurt me. I tried talking to him in private, but every time I approached him, Teresa would miraculously appear. She'd either insert herself into the conversation or whisk him away on some errand. It was frustrating, like living with a guard dog that I never asked for. Eventually, I cornered Dad in the garage, asking if he truly believed I owed them rent. He shrugged, saying that Teresa was trying her best to keep us all afloat. Then he asked if I could just go along with it for the sake of peace. That was the final straw. There would be no peace for me until they were gone. I took a few days to strategize. On one hand, I could serve them an eviction notice right away, but I worried about the fallout. I knew Dad would resent me, and the rest of the family might see me as heartless. On the other hand, I couldn't stand another moment of Teresa's bizarre power plays. She was practically acting like the owner, redecorating and dictating how I should behave in my own space. And the rent demand was the final insult. So I decided I'd gather proof of how unreasonable she was and how Dad was complicit. If anyone questioned why I was taking such drastic steps, I'd have the receipts. While I was at work, Teresa began bringing in her own furniture, swapping out my dining table for some gaudy monstrosity she found online. She replaced my couch too, claiming the old one was uncomfortable for Dad's back. When I returned, I saw my furniture stacked in the garage, collecting dust. I checked my bank statements and noticed she hadn't bought any of these items with her own money. Dad sure wasn't working, so I had no idea where the funds came from. She might have taken out a loan or borrowed from someone. Either way, she was turning my house into a reflection of her taste, without consulting me. It got worse. She set new house rules, including a curfew that I apparently needed to follow if I wanted to maintain order. I'm an adult and I pay for everything, yet she acted like my mother. Dad shrugged when I confronted him. He said Teresa was trying to bring discipline and structure. That's when I realized he'd lost his backbone entirely. It felt like she was brainwashing him into thinking he was incapable of making decisions, and he believed it. That evening, Teresa called a family meeting in the living room. She handed me a typed list of rules she expected me to follow. It included ridiculous demands like keeping my bedroom door open at all times unless I was sleeping, not having guests over without her approval, and doing all the dishes by a certain hour. She declared that since I wasn't paying rent yet, these rules would ensure I earned my keep. I looked at Dad, hoping he'd tell her this was insane, but he just nodded solemnly. Something in me snapped. I decided that was the moment I'd put my plan into action. I refused to follow any of her rules. She threatened to lock the doors if I came home after her curfew. I told her that if she even tried that, I'd have the police escort me inside. Dad tried to intervene, telling me I was overreacting, but I saw the flicker of fear in Teresa's eyes. She realized I wasn't bluffing. From that point on, I ramped up my documentation. Every time she threatened me, I wrote it down. Every time she touched or moved my belongings, I took a photo. I contacted the utility companies to make sure everything was strictly in my name so there was no confusion about who was responsible for the bills. A week later, I handed them a written notice. It wasn't an official eviction yet, but it spelled out my boundaries. If they continued to violate my personal space and tried to charge me rent, I would legally evict them. Teresa scoffed, accusing me of betraying Dad. Dad pleaded with me to reconsider, but I held firm. I told them to either respect the fact that I owned the house and let me live as I wished, or find another place to stay. Teresa responded by doubling down. She stopped cooking for me, which was no loss, and started blasting music at odd hours to provoke me. She even posted a message on social media claiming I was an ungrateful brat who was mistreating my elderly father. Several relatives reached out, shocked by her story, but I calmly explained the truth. Most took my side once they heard the full picture, although I could sense some were skeptical. Dad, meanwhile, seemed torn. He told me he loved me, but begged me not to make Teresa mad. He said she was the best thing to happen to him since Mom passed away, which felt like a punch in the gut. It was as though he'd forgotten all the years we struggled together, the sacrifices we made. Still, I maintained my composure. I refused to let Teresa or Dad guilt-trip me. I consulted with my attorney friend again, who advised me to proceed with an official eviction if they refused to comply. I wrestled with the idea. Evicting my own father felt unforgivably harsh, but I also couldn't live under Teresa's tyranny. One night, I heard them arguing in the master bedroom. Teresa was shouting about how they needed to take control before I ruined everything. Dad's voice was muffled, but he sounded distressed. I wondered if there was any chance he'd snap out of it and side with me. The next morning, Teresa poured half a box of salt into my coffee grounds, presumably to punish me for ignoring her rules. I spat out my first sip, furious. That same day, I discovered she'd removed my laptop from my room. I found it downstairs with suspicious new programs installed, some budgeting software she must have thought would help her manage finances. It felt like an invasion of privacy. I finally reached my breaking point that afternoon. I marched into the living room where Teresa was watching some daytime talk show and told her I'd had enough. I gave her a final ultimatum: respect my home or get out. She sneered at me, then called Dad over to witness my meltdown. He ambled in, looking exhausted. Before she could rattle off her rehearsed insults, I dropped the bomb. I had already prepared official eviction papers with help from my attorney friend, and I intended to serve them if she continued her nonsense. Teresa's eyes widened and she let out a disbelieving laugh. She didn't think I'd actually follow through. But I did. I handed the papers to Dad, explaining that they had 30 days to vacate if they couldn't comply with my terms. Teresa screamed at me, called me ungrateful, accused me of abandoning my father, and even threatened to sue me for emotional distress. Dad just stood there, tears in his eyes. He asked how I could do this to him. My heart twisted in my chest, but I kept my resolve. This was the only way to reclaim my life from Teresa's tyranny. Teresa spent the next few days trying to rally family members against me. She painted me as some greedy homeowner who was kicking out her poor husband's father. Several relatives called or messaged me, asking why I was being so heartless. I calmly explained how Teresa had taken over my home, demanded I pay them rent, and systematically destroyed my peace of mind. I directed them to the evidence I'd been collecting. Some changed their tune once they saw how manipulative she'd been, while others urged me to find a middle ground. But there was no middle ground left. She'd crossed the line too many times. My father had stood by her side, enabling her every step of the way. On the day they finally left, I made sure to be there to watch them pack. Teresa hurled insults at me, claiming I'd regret kicking them out. Dad wouldn't look me in the eye. He mumbled that he had hoped I'd forgive him, but clearly, he hadn't realized the damage he'd done by siding with her. I helped them carry a few boxes to their car, more for Dad's sake than Teresa's, but the tension was thick. Teresa threatened to ruin my reputation if I didn't apologize, and I just laughed in her face. I reminded her that she had no power over me anymore, and if she continued harassing me, I'd have a restraining order filed faster than she could say rent. They drove off, leaving behind a trail of bitterness. The next few days, I took stock of what they'd left. The master bedroom was a mess. Holes in the walls, scratched floors, and a broken door handle. Most of my furniture was shoved into the garage or the basement. I spent hours restoring my home to the way it was before they arrived. It felt liberating to reclaim my space, even if it meant cleaning up their literal and metaphorical mess. Part of me waited for Dad to call and apologize, but he never did. Instead, I heard through the grapevine that they were staying with one of Teresa's relatives now, someone who apparently had no idea what they were in for. I received a few snide texts from Teresa accusing me of breaking Dad's heart. I ignored them. I had no intention of forgiving or forgetting. I figured Dad made his choice, and Teresa revealed her true colors. They weren't my problem anymore. As for my reputation, all the evidence was on my side, and most of the family eventually recognized that Teresa was the toxic one. I never forgave him. I doubt I ever will. He chose Teresa over me, and I won't pretend otherwise. If he ever decides to leave her, maybe we'll talk, but I'm not holding my breath. My house is my sanctuary again, and I've learned the hard way that not all family deserves kindness. Sometimes you have to protect yourself, even from your own blood. Forever.